Welcome to Rooted to Thrive, conversations to elevate our humanity. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson Ansari, Professor P for short. This is your podcast sanctuary for cultivating mindsets and skills to elevate our shared humanity. We're taking a deep dive into practical strategies to evolve as anti-racist, culturally competent, and inclusive individuals and leaders. In each episode, we're bringing you real-world examples and actionable takeaways. We're going to talk about personal growth, fostering connection, and creating positive change that dismantles systemic barriers and creates environments where all of us are valued, empowered, and activate our collective power. This is Rooted to Thrive. Welcome and welcome back to Rooted to Thrive. Today, our topic is confronting white supremacy in our daily lives. I am your host, Rochelle Peterson Ansari, aka Professor P. We are Rooted to Thrive, having conversations to elevate our humanity. And today, we have Dr. Dave Stovall, Professor of Black Studies, Criminology, Law, and Justice at UIC, which is the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dave is a notable scholar, global scholar, and activist. And when I say activist, I mean activist. You'll see what I'm talking about. And he's working with communities, students, and teachers. Dave locks arms with community members, critical educators to create relevant curriculum through his work with People's Education Movement. He's looking to abolish school to prison nexus with the Abolitionist Teaching Network. He advances justice-centered education as a founding member of the Critical Race Studies and Education Association, helped design the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice, and get this, volunteered there as a social studies teacher for 13 years. But more importantly, Dave is one of those people who fills my cup. Every time he speaks from the stage or around the kitchen table, I want to take out my notebook. He is a sage who walks the walk. I'm in awe of your brilliance, Dave, your down-to-earth warmth, and your love for our people. Dave, I'm honored to have you joining me today to just share just a little bit of the light that you've shared with me and countless others. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. I'm so excited to have you speak on the topic, confronting white supremacy in our daily lives. So to get started, can you share what it means to confront white supremacy in our daily lives and how that elevates our humanity?
Definitely. And thank you for the question. And thank you for this work. I think the first thing is to understand what white supremacy is, right?
Okay.
A lot of times people kind of corner it off and think about it as, white acts of terror, right?
Mm-hmm.
So somebody dropping a cross on your lawn, firebombing your house. That's only one part of it, right? I think it's important for us to think about white supremacy as the perceived or assumed views and values of white, Western European descended, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual Christian males as normal, right, and good.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is othered. Everything out of that frame is made strange.
Mm-hmm.
And everything out of that frame has been rationalized to abuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now when we think about that, when we talk about confronting it, is first understanding what it is, how it operates in our day-to-day, and then how it uplifts our humanity. That confrontation uplifts our humanity by saying, I don't agree with that, right? And because I don't agree with that, here are the things that I'm willing to do. And because I don't agree with that, now I'm going to find other people who also don't agree with that and do not feel subject to those assumed views and values, right? And I
Yes.
think that thing around people think about that kind of myopic viewpoint of white supremacy, and now the confrontation, people think about it as this kind of first a physical confrontation, right? When you
Mhm.
say the word confrontation, but
Mhm.
what it really is confronting it in your own mind, right?
Yes.
So that thing around like I was in this really strange phone call yesterday with some folks that I was unfamiliar with, and I was doing it as part of this connection to a guy that I've known from some community work, and it ended up being these black Trumpers. I was like, man,
Mhm.
what is really happening right now? But
Mhm.
that thing that I laid out to them was, look, the first place you have to confront this is yourself. And
Yes.
do you want to imitate the
Mhm.
actions of
Mhm.
your former captors? Right.
Mhm.
So this thing around really just being clear about that. But I think back to your question around it allows us to uplift our humanity when we say there is something else and we
Yes.
can actually do something else.
Yes. So you talked about privileged identities, right? In defining that. What does that look like? Okay, you said that there are some, Black Trumpers, but even outside of the political realm, even though it's all political, I understand that. What does it look like to privilege those identities and other everyone else in ways that are not individualistic? How
Mhm.
is it institutionalized? Just, one example. How is it institutionalized or structural?
Yeah, I think when we think about the ways in which it is structured, one of the things, and a colleague of mine, Ash Stevens, always reminds me of this. When we talk about families, the assumption is always this kind of heteronormative family, right? It's always this kind of cisgender, opposite sex situation that we think that we normalize in our heads,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the history of the planet tells us that that is not how the rest of the world operates, right? So this thing around really thinking about the structures
Mm-hmm.
that now justify this family, right? I mean, like even you filling out a form, right? You don't see cis hetero male, right? You see
Right.
male
Right.
female, right? In
Correct.
opposed to cis hetero male, female identified, none of that, right?
Right.
But we know the world actually has a different construction around how families operate, right? And I think when we start to wrestle with that,
Mm-hmm.
then we can actually start to think about how certain identities are privileged in that construction, right? And
Yes.
really, when you think about things, and you got me thinking about, even in more precarious situations like domestic violence court, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the space is still situated around women identified folks and children being the property of men. Like when you see how the law is constructed, and then who has rights to what, and then what the burden of proof is in certain spaces, now you get to understand why folks don't engage in that system, right? Because it's not structured to actually support you, right? It's structured to deeply interrogate and castigate you
Yes.
despite you being in harm's way, right?
Yes.
So I think those are two
Good
examples for me
examples.
that
Mm.
stick out in terms of how certain identities are privileged.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. And I'm going to backtrack just a little bit, right? Because I think it's important for people to know kind of where we come from, right? Like, if you could share a little bit about your background and how you became involved in this work.
Yeah, I'm born and raised in Chicago. My mom and my mom is a Southerner. My father is also a Chicagoan. His mom, my grandmother, is a Southerner. So my mom's family is from Alabama and Mississippi. My dad's family is from Arkansas. So coming up, my grandmother was a very avid reader, and she was very active in terms of paying attention to history. Like that was really a part of her understanding. And when I was little, I would just be in a bookshelf, just kind of looking at stuff or what have you. And her partner was actually a Buddhist, which was really interesting coming up because
Mhm.
he was a Buddhist, but he read a lot of Marx, right? So I grew up reading, the Little Red Book, not really knowing what it was, waking up in the morning to him doing Nam Yoho Reke Cho, right? So I like it was his whole experience as a young person in the 70s. I'm saying to myself, whoa, wow, this is a whole different thing. But when I got to high school, it was my peer group that actually brought me in to a space around thinking about things differently. So I tell this story a lot, but I was in a chemistry classroom, and my guy who was my lab partner, he looked at the teacher and he was like, man, look, this is trash. Yo. Look, we ain't even, I'm not even on this. He was like, this is what you need to be reading. And he pulled out this red book and it was called The Selected Speeches of Malcolm X. So, we had our books propped up. So instead of paying attention in chemistry class, I'm just reading selected speeches of Malcolm X. I'm Ballad of the Bullet, Message to the Grassroots. I'm like, oh, so this is, and what it allowed me to do was connect to my grandmother's bookshelf, right? So it was like, man, okay,
Yes.
this is what Paul Robeson was talking about. This is what James Baldwin was talking about. This is who Toni Morrison is, right? This is how Toni K. Bambara is in order. So like it was that space. And then I had another classmate who was like, look, we got all these Black students in the schoolhouse and we don't have a class about us. Come with me to the principal's office and we're going to get a class about us. And little did I know, she had already done the organizing. She had already talked to the teachers like, look, if I get this class on deck, will you be able to teach it? And he was like, no problem. So we actually, like through her, I actually got a sense of you do the work, not necessarily for your benefit, but for folks who will see it down the line. So
Right.
the class got approved, but I was never able to take it. So that was a lesson. That was a lesson for me on why you do the work, right? It's not necessarily what is seen in the immediate, right? But it is the long struggle. So that those two spaces were deeply influential because it allowed for me to create a litmus, right? So now I wanted to see what people were talking about, and then I also wanted to see what people were doing, right? So now it's the connection of words matching actions. So
Yeah.
that was deeply influential to me in terms of being able to think about uh, the work a little differently.
Wonderful. So you brought up a lot of things. First of all, how youth will lead us. Yes. And we underestimate them quite a bit still. Yes. But again, thinking about what you experienced when that started you thinking about this work and the collectivism. I hear that, but I also heard you say that one person approached a teacher, yes, and said, hey, we don't see ourselves here. That opened a door,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's something we can do in our daily lives. And she brought people along with her to make that change that they may not see,
Mm-hmm.
but the power of the collective made it happen for those to come after us. That's the blueprint, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a
Mm-hmm.
blueprint for
Mm-hmm.
change. Now, when we look closely at white supremacy, right? So where was I just want you to make it plain for, whoever's listening, where was the white supremacy? How was that playing out in that situation, right? Like being in chemistry class, just to
Mhm.
make that plain.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the whole apparatus of schooling, right? So this thing
Okay.
around, you're in a class, nobody's really making it relevant. So now you just disconnect, right? So what do I have to do to get through this thing, right? So we ask young people to suffer through their conditions in school, right? We're asking them to suffer through it, right? And white supremacy says you should suffer through it because you are undeserving of this thing and you must prove to the collective body or the people who hold white supremacy that you are worthy, right? And you will always be castigated and only approved to the extent that the folks who have created that system remain in power, right?
Right.
So it's this thing around, and a thing I always tell people, like, systems aren't created to destroy themselves, right? Systems are created to perpetuate themselves. So now in that situation in chemistry class, the whole apparatus of schooling around its irrelevance, around the disconnectedness, was now the space that my classmates made an active decision to interrupt, right? On their own volition, right? Just being like, look, if I'm gonna be in here, then this ain't the way, right? So
Right.
we got to figure something else out.
Right. That's
Right.
right. And you're speaking to education for liberation,
Mm-hmm.
right? You are speaking to that. And that's something different than what we are seeing in our schools today. Yes. So can you talk about, I mentioned some of those initiatives, movements that you are a part of now. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe an example of a successful initiative, movement that you've led or been a part of that is chipping away at the supremacy of whiteness?
So this thing around looking at spaces that I've participated in, I think one of the things that had a lasting memory for me was being able to see changes in people over time. And it was a community, and it started with a community history fair, right? So, in Illinois, they have this history fair, which is kind of this thing that's judged by the state. But a group of young folks, and it was a group of people they called themselves Taifa Community Change Organization. And Taifa is Swahili for change. So uh uh I'm sorry, Taifa is Swahili for nation. But they so we were, I was talking with them and they were like, look, we got this history fair, but they was like, oh, we want to do something different. So how do we actually start to think about the people who were important to us? Right. And everybody in the group were like, okay, cool. And these are all young folks between the ages at that time, like 12 and 15. And they were like, look, this is what we're gonna do. So they just did this whole history. They like did their poster boards, what have you, and it was all Black folks. And they were like, "Look, this is what we're doing." And they went, and people were like, "Well, it's not Black History Month," and it was like, "Every day is Black History Month." That's how they got down. And I was like, "Okay, word." And then they took it to the teacher, and the teacher was like, "Oh, this is what y'all are on. Okay, cool." So she made all of her classes say, okay, if you do the project, you got to do it about somebody that you're interested in, somebody in your family or your neighborhood. So that changed up the whole space. And what it allowed me to see was young people being clear about what it was that they were trying to do and how that was transformative for adults, right? So
Yes.
the adults were just like, oh, all right, we can
Yes.
support this, right?
Right.
We can make this happen. And I thought, and that was really influential in my thinking because it was like, okay, look, if you give folks room to do what it is that they're trying to do, all these other things just open up, right?
Yes.
Because when they presented to the parents was like, oh, this is what y'all are doing. A couple of parents was like, look, what else do y'all need, right? How can we figure this out, do it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when the history fair people came, they were like, oh, they were like, oh, this is complete. This is a completely different shift. And
Yes.
they liked it, right? They were like, oh, this is because what happened was they just weren't talking about, noted figures in history, but they were talking about efforts to change communities, right? They were talking about
Yes.
people who were doing the work on the ground. And
Mhm.
that was really important for me because it allowed me to see the possibility of the work, right?
Yes.
And that in that possibility, now you can rethink some of those spaces and just how it really opened up all of these different lanes for folks. And I'm just thinking as I'm just going over in my
That's
head,
okay.
man, it was all these other spaces that just kind of opened up. They're like, okay, look, y'all trying to do this? Okay, we got some space over here at the gym. Okay, y'all wanna do this? My uncle works at such and such. I'm gonna call him. We're gonna get everything. Just this whole
Yes.
line of work
Yes.
that just
Opened
opened
up.
up by way of people saying, okay, here's what's possible. And if we listen to the folks who are saying what's important and relevant to them,
Yes.
then we got a greater chance to engage in something that is more educative, right?
Yes. This is possible. And yes, what you described was culturally relevant,
Mm,
right? It was relevant, their communities, their neighborhoods, their families, people on the
mm,
ground. Yes.
mm-hmm,
And that's even antithetical to what we tend to lift up, right, in this
mm-hmm,
country, right? Notable figures, right? Like you want to aim to be that person that's out front, and everybody
mm-hmm.
doesn't do public speaking.
Right,
But
right,
right.
right. The leadership rhetoric, right?
Right. So we have
Right.
elitism on top of, right, on
Yep.
top of the standard,
Yep.
right, that whiteness is right. You know,
Yep.
I often share with people that, I bought the hype when I was younger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I understood that what white people had was somehow better, right?
Yep.
Like from what I saw tangibly, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I tangibly saw the difference. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in
Mm-hmm.
East New York to be exact. It's like
Mm-hmm.
Brownsville
Yeah.
and in Brooklyn. And, hey, I lived in a building, 6 floors, we
Mm-hmm.
had concrete floors, elevators, I think there might have been bulletproof glass. Like in the
Mm-hmm.
70s, we didn't have those worries as much in our
Right. Yeah.
neighborhoods. Um, but it was some kind of plasticky glass,
Mm-hmm.
no door people or anything like that. And then I had the privilege of going to a private school.
Mm-hmm.
And someone tapped me on the shoulder, when I was in junior high school, um, to take a test for the A Better Chance program.
Uh-huh.
Then I get, I take the test, I pass, I get invited to apply to these private schools
Mm-hmm.
for high school. And excuse me, my mama wasn't letting me go to a boarding school because I was literally only 13. She was like, no, I'm not finished raising her. But I then enter this world at Brooklyn Friends School,
Mm-hmm.
carpeted floors, an elevator with an attendant,
Right.
right? And the majority of the people, unlike in my neighborhood, right, Black and Puerto Rican
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, are white.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I want these things too,
Right.
right? I
Right.
have these things too, but I was associating it with what white people had.
Mm-hmm.
And I always had the spirit of, like, I'm going to have what men have because somehow I
Mm-hmm.
knew as a
Mm-hmm.
young girl that I didn't have what men had,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so even when the decision to go to college came up, I actually did not go to a HBCU, and today I regret it.
Mm-hmm.
Did apply to at least one.
Mm-hmm.
I got in, but I actually chose to go to the school that gave me the most money.
Mm-hmm.
But there was something in my admissions letters that made me think that I was going to get under-resourced at
Mhm.
this historically Black college.
Mhm.
And again, all of the stories from what was on television, what was, being said in my household, like you got to be 10 times better
Right.
than,
Right.
right? I was being trained to always need approval by white folks or by
Yep.
some other,
Yep.
right, that had privilege that I didn't have. Yes.
Mhm.
And that didn't serve me well as an
Mhm.
adult.
Mhm.
It served me well as an adult. Only in those spaces where I was able to to be liberated. It actually wasn't until I found sociology in college
Mm.
that I began to look, things that you knew weren't right. I could develop a language. I found
Mhm.
Freire in grad school,
Mhm.
who started with how people make meaning, right, in terms of educating them.
Mhm.
Like that was education for liberation. So all of these things that were, well, I would say they were available to us, but I wasn't exposed to it, right? I had to make my way. And,
Mhm.
I'm someone I have more days behind me than in front of me now,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I think
Mhm.
so.
Mhm.
And I want those children, I have grandchildren now. I want
Mhm.
those children to see themselves the way I did when I had my first African American women's writers course,
Mhm.
right? But that was in college.
Right.
How different they could be if they see themselves, right, in elementary school.
Right.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I am going to say this for the girls, especially too, right? Like we also have to work with our families
Mhm.
because they're perpetuating what they learned as well.
Yep.
Yeah. And even though it's not everybody, many of our families where there are people who have not gone to college and they sit around and
Mhm.
talk about these things, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, even a lot of people who go to college don't talk about these things.
Mhm.
But,
Mhm.
haven't had those opportunities to talk about these things and think about it critically and really own it, they are also participating,
Mhm.
right, in bringing many generations before us, like the things they didn't know, they're still bringing it into the present
Mhm.
for our children. And they don't know, they also don't know, many of them don't know how to get the schools to give them what they need.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about them as I talk to you, and I'm wondering what advice you might give to someone who wants to be anti-racist
Mhm.
in education, be anti-racist in their community for their liberation.
Mhm. I think one thing that's just important as a basic step,
Okay.
take nothing for face value,
Okay.
right? It's always this thing around the development of our criticality or our capacity to be critical says that you take nothing for face value. And now you look so anything that you are interested in, you now have to be willing to go deep, right? So now, whatever it is that kind of pegs your interest, be open to go deep into it, right? So
Mm.
it's not necessarily this kind of rabbit hole chasing, but it's saying, if I go deep into this, I will now see how other things are connected, right? And this kind of a strange story. Literally last night on one of my guys' back porch, he talked about this book called Bourbon Justice. And this dude who was a distiller actually started to look at the licensing of names of distilleries.
Mm.
And then he started to go back into the history, and a lot of your copyright laws and laws around having the rights to a name come from urban distillers, right? But he finds that out, by his interests, going deep, and now figuring out the connection. So there's a longtime community activist here in Chicago by the name of Carol Adams. She would always say this thing to me. She would say, look, do one thing well so you know how the rest of the world works.
Mm.
And
Mm.
what that was, always saw that as being, if you take something that you're interested in, you will now see how it is connected to all these other things, right? And I think that's really important in terms of developing a critical lens. I think another thing is using the litmus of not what people say, but what people do. And now, does what people say match what they do? Right? So we all have contradictions, but who are the folks who are living in a way to match what they say in terms of what they are doing? Right? And I think when you see that, it allows you to think about possibility, right? So when you talk about your grandkids, and it's like seeing folks who are like, okay, well, who's really doing this? Who's really paying attention? Who's operating in a way that is, as the young folks say, standing on business, right? Saying, what does it actually mean to do this work in a way that is not just about individual gain, but connected to the betterment of larger groupings of people, right? So how is that actually visualized? How do we see that? How do we understand that? And then I think a thing for me, personally, and something that I try to look for is, who are the folks who are humble, right? How are we humble, right? So it's important to be humble, not that we know all things, not that we are the best to ever do it, but to say, who, I am constantly trying to improve, but I also want to be in community with folks as I am trying to do this work. So our friend Doc Rich Benson always tells me this story. Like, there's a historian by the name of Gerald Horn. And I mean, when I tell you the way this guy thinks and produces is just surreal, right? I mean, he could just be like, if he wanted to, he could come out and just be like, look, I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? Because he has all of these books. But when you meet him, he's the most straightforward, humble dude, right? He's just like, yeah, I'm all right.
Right.
And that's about it. Like, he doesn't, and then, in my travels to blah, 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 he's just like,
Right.
no, all right.
Right.
I've written a few things, they, some are available, some are better than others. Right? I mean, he doesn't, like, he doesn't have any pretentiousness about what he does. He's just like, here's what I do. I can, I'm more than happy to share it with folks. All good. I'm just like, wow. Like, and to me, that's an example of what it means to be humble. And at the same time, he is clear about his work, right? He does his work in a way that makes sense to him. And that work is to be shared and distributed to the folks who he cares about. I mean, like, that's literally how he thinks about his work.
Yes. Thank you. So yeah, being humble is important. And I used to think that being humble meant you didn't, self-promote, things like that. In this world that we're in today, right? We do have to push our voices out there because everybody is looking through a screen now, right? But we have the opportunity to have a greater impact globally through this vehicle as well. And so you've already had one. and you will continue to grow. So I know that I am blessed, even honored to be in your sphere, someone who is also, to me, the epitome of like brilliance that is humble as well. So I don't,
No,
I
I
don't,
appreciate
I mean, I really do feel that way. So before we close, I want to circle back. I'm thinking because this is so important for people to let go of what we consider, that individualized perspective of what white supremacy is. If you have, some advice specific to that, right? Like, so we have to change our mindset. Okay. Now, yours may have been changed many years ago, right? When you were younger. But have you seen anyone in more recent years, right? Like, as adults, as leaders, as educators, make a shift? I love the example of the community fair, right? And the
it.
teachers at that example, but anyone that you have actually, seen, heard shift from that individual perspective on what white supremacy is to the understanding of what it really is, and
Mhm.
and 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 seeing their actions change.
Mhm. Yeah, I used to at UIC, every now and then I would have student athletes in my class. And there was one student athlete who was Puerto Rican, and he had been kind of estranged from the Puerto Rican side of his family. He comes to UIC and he gets awakened, right? So he starts to see, oh wow. And he was, as a basketball player, he was just like, okay, I hope this is what I do. But when he came out, he was just like, oh, wait, there's a whole different thing here, right? Puerto Ricans have fought for their liberation way before the Grito de Lares, right? So,
Uh-huh.
so he was like, oh, right. So now people are talking about, liberation and how liberation is connected and what people do to make sure that other folks are supported. So he started on as a writer. So he was really sharp as a writer. So he would write, then he would do poetry, then he started to do work with a community-based organization. And he was just like, man, like how did I get shut off from this? But when he took it into a totally different stratosphere, right? I saw, so in him, I saw the capacity of someone to change, right? And then
Okay.
really kind of use it in all of his work, right? Longtime educator now. I mean, I've known him for over 20 years now, right? And his pathway
Mhm.
started by being opened up at the university and in community space. And then he has always situated himself around transformation, right? How do we now engage in the practice of transformation in
Yes.
light of his own, right?
Yes.
And his name
Yes.
is Matt Rodriguez, right? And he does this work, and he's just like, man, like, and he has really internalized what it means to transform oneself.
Yes.
And now thinking about it in real time. So what does that transformation look like? Who do we build with? What are the terms and conditions that we now take into every space we enter? And it's a really interesting piece because I remember him as the basketball player who
Yes.
now said, oh, there's a whole different world out here that I've now
Yes.
come uh abreast of, right? And it's
Yes.
that to me is a very clear example of transformation, right? How we actually look at our world, and then when our perspective changes, we do different things because we see our world differently.
Differently. That's right. So I heard exposure, right? The exposure to something new had to be there, right? And something that is, excuse me, critical to help him make his own choice, right? About what he was hearing. I heard know thyself. Yes, that there was some understanding about his history that was hidden from him. That's why it's so important for our children, for our young adults to get that history as well. And that's all of them, right? If the history was not hidden, we would have different outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If the history was not hidden. And then I heard through that was a catalyst to the transformation. And something you've been saying throughout this entire episode, that he saw where he could build, but it wasn't alone.
Mm-hmm.
It's always in connection with others. We can't do it alone. And yeah, I would then dare say that this penchant toward individualism, right? It's in our culture, right? To uphold individualism is standing in our way.
Mm-hmm.
You'd agree?
Mm-hmm. Without question.
Yeah.
Without question.
Yeah. So the collective, locking arms with others in your sphere of influence, is going to be a catalyst toward your liberation and the liberation of people that you care about that come after.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I thank you so much. I thank you so much, Dr. Stovall. Now, I didn't mention all of your books, and I have several on my shelf. It's Born Out of Struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I even have the Social Justice Handbook, Social Justice in Education Handbook that you edited. You're like, oh, like that's old news to you. That's one of my Bibles. I keep it nearby. Have you had any more recent publications, like a book that I haven't mentioned?
So about 4 years ago, me and a group of folks co-wrote a piece called 20th Century Jim Crow Schools, which is about the charter movement. And then I'm working on a piece right now, trying to turn it into the publishers in about a month, that I'm calling Engineered Conflict. And it's about school closings, the destruction of public housing, and law enforcement strategies in Chicago. And the argument that I'm making is we're never talking about people who are inherently violent. Instead, we're talking about people who have been thrust into particular situations where violence is more likely to occur. So again, a structural analysis of what school closings, destruction of public housing, and then law enforcement strategies have meant in a place like Chicago.
Oh, yes. And then that's going to keep the people, right, in violence.
Mm-hmm.
And would you dare say that is design? Because you said
right, exactly.
Eric,
Hence
right?
The nature of the idea of being engineered. Yep.
Boy, we have to get to our people. We have to get to our people to understand that they are being they're like puppets.
Mm-hmm.
When
and if we're not careful, anybody can be in that situation, right? So
that's right.
Critical lens allows us to say, well, wait, how have I been pitted against certain folks? And then being pitted against certain folks with the idea that if you eliminate each other, now that makes this thing easier to control.
Yes.
In the way that white supremacy wants to do it.
Yes. When did you say that's hitting the
so I'm trying to turn it in to the publisher this August, and then do a review process. So I'm hoping that summer of 25.
Okay, that is coming out. Boy, I love books, but boy, they take too long to get out into the world.
Real talk.
Again, Dr. Stovall, I want to thank you, Dave. I thank you for being so generous as always with your time and your expertise. Is there a way people can find you after this episode or contact you?
Yep, if they just look at the UIC website, and it's just
Yes.
uic.edu,
Mhm.
and if you go to either Black Studies or Criminology, Law, and Justice,
Yes.
go to the faculty page,
Yes.
find my name,
That's right.
all my info will show up.
That's right. And so your name will be spelled out in the show notes. And yes, I found it myself. Just by your name. I want to thank you and thank everyone who stopped by to listen. Please leave a comment and share this episode. Thank you for listening to Rooted to Thrive.